Dolapo, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dolapo Adeyemi, and on behalf of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation's Now Generation Network, I would like to welcome you to this edition of our debates. Like I said, I'll be your moderator, and as we dive into one of the most critical questions facing us, in our time, facing our continent. Should Africa's approach to international relations be strategic or transactional? I see that there is a poll that has popped up on the screen. So if you can take a moment and respond to that poll, that would be fantastic. And just so you know, this is really close to our hearts. We don't consider this to be just a debate about financing or foreign policy. We consider this to be a conversation about power, dignity, and direction. When we ask if Africa should, whether or not we should negotiate like a business partner or as a block of principled peers, what we're really wondering is, should, for instance, on one end, considering the fact that the world runs on deals, Africa must wake up and play the game. That is the argument of one side, whilst the other side insists that short-term wins can become long-term traps. So we are joined today by four brilliant speakers from across the Mo Ibrahim Foundation community, each bringing fresh perspectives and bold ideas. And you, the audience, will have a chance to contribute questions and reflections later in the session. So this is how we're going to run today. We'll begin with opening statements from each side. Then we will go into questions. These questions are sort of designed to dig deeper into the opposition. And after that, each side will propose a bold, fundable policy that reflects their stance. And finally, we'll explore questions from the audience, and we will close out the debates. So right now, I'm giving the floor to our debaters. But first of all, let me introduce them. So representing the transactional approach, that's the pro side. I think we have Topwa Lesinko and Mudukwe Ige. And representing the strategic approach, we have Lolade Mengisti and Christian Bimoala. Thank you all for being here and for bringing your voice to this important conversation. So over to you, the pro side, Topwa and Mo. The floor is yours. What are your opening statements?
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Our opening statement is essentially, Africa must wake up to the brutal truth of the 21st century. The global order is not built on sentiment, it is built on self-interest. And we're seeing that the world is fragmenting into protectionist blocks, power is realigning in multipolar fashion, and economic uncertainty is deepening. African nations can no longer afford to play the polite, principled bystander. Africa must become shrewd, strategic actors, and that means embracing a transactional approach to negotiations and international engagement. Anything less will be tantamount to political naivety and economic self-sabotage. Let's look at the numbers. In 2023, African economies grew at just 3.2%, far below Asia's 5%. And when you adjust that for the population, the reality is even worse. African nations are becoming on average poorer, not wealthier. And you're thinking about the fact that the economy is primarily moving to leverage, be it data, technology, minerals, or military alliances. Africa is still showing up to the global table with its resources, but not with its terms. And we need to start dictating our terms. And yet, we're looking at the huge card that Africa holds. 30% of the world's mineral reserves, 12% of the world's oil, and 8% of the natural gas resides in Africa. We have a booming youthful population. We have cocoa in West Africa, cobalt in DRC, manganese in South Africa. And these resources are the things that are fueling the global transition that we're seeing, be it green transition. We're seeing a lot of things in AI. These things are what fuels that. But despite all of this, things that Africa has, we are seeing that we continue to trade our resources as if we were still in 1960, raw, unprocessed, and on someone else's terms. No value add, just resources. Meanwhile, the transactional nature of the global power is becoming increasingly clear. Just recently, last week, we heard about the US cutting about $555 million in aid to the African Development Bank. What that means is we see that a lot of developing countries that actually depended on this will be impacted primarily. And ultimately, we are seeing that it's not, would I say, it's not charity, right? It's just business. Anything that does not align with the current administration's priority is cut off. We're also seeing other developed economies such as France and the UK reducing their official developmental assistance. What everybody is saying is if it's not working for us, then we cut it off. The question is, why is Africa not doing the same? We have the resources. There's no press conference, no apologies. It's business. And clearly, all that is to say that if the geopolitical mass no longer adds up, the partnerships will vanish. It is it's just business, right? Like I said. So if everyone else is negotiating like business partners, why is Africa still negotiating like we're a charity case? We're not charity. And this is not a call for hostility. It is just a call for reciprocity. African countries must begin to ask, what is the return on every investment for every barrel of oil, every kilogram of lithium, every bilateral handshake that we're having? What is in it for us? How can we get synchronized in the value chain? What infrastructure, what skill transfer, what market assets are we demanding in return for our resources? If no value is flowing back to Africa, the answer should be no deal. There needs to be value add back coming to Africa. And we also need to stop competing as fragmented 54 countries and start negotiating as a united bloc. The AFCFTA no longer needs to just be paperwork. It actually needs to be a weapon of economic coordination. Imagine if Africa actually sets collective resource pricing, impose value-added clauses on our mineral exports, saying that we need to be in the value chain, or jointly negotiated AI data sovereignty. That is power. In March, which is about 2 months ago, we actually heard about the DRC approaching the Trump administration, trying to negotiate the fact that the US would have access to the mineral reserves of DRC in exchange for military alliances. Ukraine also had a similar deal just recently, about last week or 2 weeks ago. And all of this is to say, imagine if that negotiation was not just for military alliances, it was for infrastructure. It is for things like productivity that improves the manufacturing and the lives of the people in Africa. That indeed is power. And ultimately, that is what we believe that Africa should be doing. Africa's destiny will be shaped by negotiation, not being charity. Transactional diplomacy is not cynical. Right now, it is survival. And the global order is evolving. And if Africa does not evolve with it, ultimately, we will be left to be exporting our raw materials and we're importing poverty ultimately. So Africa needs to be a negotiator, a power, and we need to be a force to be reckoned with. We have all that it takes. So
Wow.
I'll stop there.
What a powerful opener, Modupe. Thank you so much for that opener. We are showing up at the table with our mineral resources, but not on our terms. I mean, if the world is saying, if the world is being transactional, why not us? That is very fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that. I can't wait to hear from the con side, Lolade and Christian. We're ready for your response. Please go ahead.
Thank you. We really think that in a world where global power relentlessly pursue their own interests, believing that transactional bilateral agreement will sustainably secure African long-term interests is a dangerous illusion. On the contrary, Africa's future depends not on fragmented bilateralism, but on deep-knit integration, principally multilateralism, and strategic partnership rooted in solidarity and shared interests. Here is why we argue African nations must continue to promote its value. If you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. Transactionalism is a short-term model that sacrifices long-term strategic interests. African experience with resources for infrastructure deals such as the 2008 Psychoman Agreement in the DRC is a statement to this reality. A 2023 audit revealed over 500 million in untraceable funds, underscoring how weak governments and opaque contracts overwhelmingly benefit external actors, not African citizens. In Nigeria, similar dynamics led to the expulsion of Chinese oil firms for mining code violation. These are not isolated incidents. They reflect a broader trend of extractive engagement that thrives in the absence of transparency and institutional strength. And Africa's greatest geopolitical asset is its collective weight. Transactionalism undermines this by encouraging countries to negotiate in isolation, compete with neighbor, and dilute shared agendas. The result, fragmentation, dependency, and diminished leverage. This is precisely what the AFCFTA was designed to overcome: a competitive, integrated, and African market, not scattered. Deal is the vehicle for economic transformation and global relevance. We really think that the AFCFTA is a blueprint for long-term collective sovereignty, because it's not just a trade agreement, it's an historic act of economic self-determination with 48 ratification and 5 legal protocols. It aims to expand intra-African trade, still just 14.9 of African total trade, build regional value chain, harmonize competition and intellectual property policies, facilitate investment and industrial transformation, and ultimately encourage free movement of people within the continent. This will reduce costs, improve efficiency, and enable African firms to scale credible path to structural transformation and collective economic sovereignty, even if it's a long-term project. And we really also trust that African strategic partnership must support unity, not to fragment it, because bilateral deals are shaped by leverage, not law. Transactionalism favorize powerful actors who dedicate terms. For African, this results in extractive agreements, bypass institutional and wicked governance. It opened the door to corruption, reduce policy coherence, and sideline long-term planning. The IU tendency to pursue bilateral economic partnership agreement with individual African states that, for example, in some way fragment the continent trade agenda and strain AFC FTA implementation. This is neocolonialism by another name. We are not agreeing for disengagement, but we are going for better engagement, strategic engagement that leverage our united and strong position. And multilateralism platforms such as the WTO or the African Union or ECOWAS offer African nation legal protection, disputes settlement, and hold bargaining powers. These mechanisms are essential for smaller and weaker countries, which would otherwise be sidelined in poorly bilateral arrangement. During the COVID-19 pandemic, vaccine nationalism left African countries exposed, but continental and multilateral coordination like COVAX, the African Union task teams, and WHO engagement demonstrate the importance of collective response. The same applies to the climate finance, debt relief, and global trade governance. Regarding to the debt relief, for example, African United Voice through the G20 and IMF can push for reallocation of SDR and fair credit rating. For the climate change, the Nairobi Declaration on Climate speaks, Volume 1, backed by partnership with the IU in multilateral banks, trade norms, strategic alliance with emerging economic and bloc like BRICS help counter coercive trade policies and perceive police space for African industrialization. Africa must globalize its interests, not through dependency, but through solid base partnership. And as Kwame Nkrumah said, Africa must unite or perish. We really think that this words are even more relevant today. African agenda is one of cohesion, collective dependence, and productive sovereignty. In the world where
Africa must unite or perish. I couldn't help but, stop you on that one. It is a very strong statement that I believe has drawn the line for us to go into the arguments that we have here. Thank you so much again for your opener. I really enjoyed hearing that. I will go back to the pro side, and let's get into the crust of this. You mentioned about Africa being rich in resources but poor in power. We go to those tables without having real power, without having the proper terms to be able to leverage our strengths. So can transactional diplomacy change that? And how would we protect ourselves from being played in return? What is the immediate leverage you think we will get? What is the immediate autonomy negotiations we will get with global powers if we take this transactional approach?
Yeah, I can take that. Thank you very much. The problem we have, and that's, the African countries with the multilateral system or the traditional global order, is that Africa was never part of the foundational system of that. You remember that when it was during the Bretton Woods Conference in 1945, most African countries were still colonies. And the transactional approach provides the platform for the different African countries and their strategic partners to come to the table and chart a way forward. There's greater leverage, and we've actually seen already in terms of investments being channeled to countries like Angola by the US on the Latin corridor. And countries will come to the table, and the global powers are actually even willing to provide financial muscles, be it for construction of railway lines. We've seen the Latin corridor from Angola to the DRC. And I think it brings countries to a table to negotiate on an arm's length basis. What is incumbent upon Africa is to establish that capacity, because with the transactional approach, there is levying of tariff to the countries that you don't require on the table. And if you see, for example, how Ethiopia runs with China and the US, this is typically what I think that will usher in a new dawn for Africa. And definitely, I think what we need is not financial aid. We just need to be on the negotiating table, negotiate on our terms. And the challenge will be incumbent upon us to execute. Africa may be only challenge now is just to have that commitment to get the work done. But I think this is the opportunity. The transactional approach provides the platform and the opportunity for African countries to be ready and go. It's just for them to set up the industries and provide the necessary products to their strategic counterparts in the trades.
Interesting. So we don't need aid.
We
just need a proper plan and to execute. Going back to Lola Day's side, the con side, you're one of extractive, you're warning us of extractive, opaque deals. I'm just curious to know, what specific governance or institutional reforms, you think are needed to make strategic partnerships work better for Africa, and I'm looking at it from the point of view of some of the partnerships that you mentioned. ECOWAS is one of them. Those long-term strategic partnerships such as the African Union, WTO, EU, ECOWAS, and the rest of them, how have they benefited African countries economically or diplomatically up until now?
Thank you. I think I'll take this one. So I think the question is a very tricky one, because we have to make a distinction between whether or not those platforms are beneficiary and whether or not we've benefited. So our stance is that transactional approach is not the answer. We should still pursue the long-term strategic partnerships, because they have delivered to a certain extent for Africa and Africans. But as has been pointed out, it all hinges on the execution and on whether or not, as countries, we're able to govern those deals and put in place the investment necessary to leverage those platforms. So we argue that long-term strategic partnerships have offered African countries both economic and diplomatic benefits. They create the platforms for collective action, capacity building, and access to resources. So if you take, for example, the African Union, On the economic front, it has facilitated regional integration through flagship projects such as the AFCFTA, boosting inter-African trade, and the like. It has also supported us through different programs, the coordination of infrastructural programs, improvement of connectivity, reducing transaction costs. So these are actual quantifiable economic benefits that were leveraged because of this long-term strategic partnership between African countries. When you look at the RECs, such as ECOWAS, they have definitely brought about different economic benefits, such as free trade, common external tariff, reducing trade barriers in the context of ECOWAS within West African countries. It has supported joint infrastructural projects and regional integration, energy integration. On the diplomatic front, it has enabled us to do a lot, including joint responses to crises such as peacekeeping and counterterrorism. These platforms are not the only ones we should leverage, because the counter to that would be, okay, let Africa integrate within, but why do we need the multilateral platforms facing outwards? But you also see similar benefits that the WTO has given African countries. From the economic front, for example, because of the WTO technical assistance, capacity building on policy formulation and implementation, encouragement of legal and regulatory reforms, which Ethiopia is currently undergoing in its accession process. Diplomatically, we've seen what the African group has been able to do on the WTO front as well. Even the European Union, in partnership with the European Union, has come with its own benefits. We want to discount aid, but the reality is most African economies are still reliant on aid. Yes, the goal should be to move away from that, but we can only move away from that when we are able to utilize whatever aid is given to us to ensure that we never have to rely on it again. So the ODAs that we've been provided with, the technical trade related support that we get, the partnerships such as EPAs also are economic benefits that I don't think we're in a position to discount. Diplomatically, again, EU-African summits, investment agreements, trade cooperation, peacekeeping, all these have their own benefits as well. So I think all these platforms have offered African countries and Africa more broadly strategic positioning, but it all, as was said by the counter team, it all hinges on to what extent African countries can effectively and efficiently utilize these platforms, but they are nonetheless useful.
Wow, thanks a lot for that. You've made some very compelling points, but one could argue that where was WTO as an example when Trump was pulling all the plugs and all these partnerships and agreements that we had? So is being part of these organizations really an insurance for continued safe partnerships? Or do you understand what I mean? I mean, the other countries can act with impunity. We can't. We stay locked in the agreements that we agreed to, but there's some countries with greater powers that get to switch it on and off whenever they want. And the conversation around aid versus governance, aid can only go as far as governance allows it to, right? If the aid is not being used the way it's supposed to be used, we will continue begging. We will always be on the on the beggar's end, so to speak. So that kind of loops me back to the pro side. Given the shifting geopolitical landscape, you're arguing that pragmatism is more effective than long-term alliances for development goals. Is that correct? And I imagine that's a yes. Yeah. So, what I'm trying to then understand now is, how do we ensure equity in a marketplace that is tilted against us? The power is not balanced, like I've just indicated now. So how do we make sure that we remain adaptable in this sort of geopolitical landscape that we're facing?
Sorry, I'll say something briefly, Topua, if you want to go ahead. But I think my take to that would be, first, as a continent, we need to stand together, right? I think that would be the ultimate thing, right? So because we're 54 nations, but in as much as we're 54 nations, we are very, very fragmented, right? So if I take the EU, for instance, versus the African Union, which we have here, I don't think that from an effective or efficiency perspective, we are seeing the kind of leverage that we should have and come together with as a nation or as continent, right? So I'd say ultimately the first answer to that would be, to come to equity, we should have a united front. So if we look at the AFCFTA, for instance, right now is ultimately just still paperwork, right? And if I, for instance, as a Nigerian, it costs me right now more, like the same, almost equivalent, it's actually a bit more expensive to go to Ivory Coast. Ivory Coast, that's 2 hours away, than to come to Europe. And the question is, why is that? Right? Because if as a continent we don't have free trade, like all that's happening and equivalent in the Europe, in the EU, we don't have that as a continent. And so I think, first of all, we need to embrace that first. When there's that unity, then we can start to have that coherent perspective as a continent to negotiate terms when it comes to the resources that everybody has. So if you look at what is happening in the EU, when there was like the Ukraine and Russia war, in as much as there were countries like Hungary within that body that was not exactly in alliance with what the party or the unity wanted, you still didn't have a say. It's like everybody still had that main view. And we don't have that in Africa. So when you look at places like Sudan, you're saying that we're part of like the WTO, all these multilateral organizations. There has not been any benefit for Africa as such, if I say that myself, right? I think that ultimately, and all that is just born out of the fact that we still are not united as a continent. We're not exactly coming to the party with all the things that we have as a united front. And I think all that needs to be addressed. So taking free trade, for instance, within ourselves, the ability to move around, for instance, right? All the passports, and we're seeing nations like Kenya and Rwanda trying to make that happen. There needs to be that embracing from every other person. And then other people, we can now have that united front to, the external body, and say, now, Africa is serious. That's, if you come to terms with that, that's how you know that you're serious. Otherwise, it would just not be, united. It will still be different countries embracing and doing their own policies. That's what I would think. Topoi can add to that.
Yeah, precisely. I think the question here is to ask is, Somalia today is a member of the WTO. At the end of the day, the question is, what does Somalia, from the last 70 or so years, what one thing can it say that my country has really benefited because I'm a WTO member and this is our win? I think the concept of that the multilateral system is more favorable than transactional is a fallacy. And the issue is that the current global order, which we are seeking to shift from, has always been predicated on bilateral engagements. And we're actually shifting because there's a deadlock. There's a deadlock in terms of tariffs. If you see like a country like the United States, every 4 years, when the Democrats president gets elected or Republicans come into office, they come into their policies. African president convenes annually to plead and go to Washington for lifting of tariffs. And so I think this is just an alternative because what has been there is not working. And I don't foresee a situation where the current approach will be a bar to intra-African trade. How global powers perceive Africa is, they always perceive it as a bloc. And I therefore do not see a situation where Africa will stand to lose because if you see like China today invites all African Union heads of state for any summits, which I don't know if is another argument whether that is right or not. So at the end of the day, Africa is going to win. And what we are saying is transactional approach provides the most immediate and suitable way in terms of the US can, for example, trade using AGOA. So the question is, can the member countries of AGOA be able to satisfy the trade vacuum that has been, for example, left by China in textiles? because the US is no longer willing to trade with China. So I think that is a question we should ask ourselves, and whether we have the leverage. And the answer to that is, I think through those strategic partnerships, we can be able to get funding to plug those gaps and be able to industrialize like middle-income countries like Vietnam. So as I earlier on submitted, the challenge is upon us. We have the platform. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Very strong points you've made there. I just wanted to correct one thing real quickly, that Somalia is not a member of the World Trade Organization. I could see Lula Day shaking her head there. Yeah, but I hear your points. I hear what, you know, your colleague has also said in terms of Africa being very fragmented, with 54 countries, you know, and compare that to the European Union with just 27 countries. And do you know how many people make up the European Union? Just less than 450 million people. Meanwhile, in Africa, we are currently 1.54 billion, you know, and we're projected to reach up to, I think, almost 4 billion by 2100. So is it even fair that, you know, we're presenting ourselves as a bloc because we are not the same, or are we? I don't know. I'm just playing the devil's advocate here. Maybe we are, maybe we are not. But, you know, I'm curious to hear what even the audience thinks about this particular point that I'm making. But before I go to the audience, and you know, and right after this question, we'll move into policy. But let me ask the con side one question before we move to policies. You did say if we go alone, we get picked apart. But if we go together, what does unity really look like in practice? And how close are we to it? How can we, you know, what is that future? What is that vision of improving Africa's collective bargaining power in areas such as, you know, debt relief, climate finance, or trade? You know, what is that vision for you? What does unity look like in practice?
Krishna, do you want to start, and then I'll follow?
No, you can go ahead, please. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So I think as Africans, as Africa, we're very good at planning. The assumption is that we're not, but Agenda 2063, boosting inter-African trade, the AFCFTA, all paint a different picture. We're very good at planning. The issue is on execution. So, for example, when it comes to trade, we have the AFCFTA, which has been ratified by 48 countries. It's the Guided Trade Initiative, which is like the pilot testing ground for the AFCFTA, has taken off, with now 8 or 9 countries already having traded under the instrument. But I don't know to what extent our leadership is convinced of our collective potential. And I say this because our collective potential and the offerings of unity is much grander than just the numbers that we've just forwarded. It's beyond even our ability to imagine, because we're talking about 1.3 billion market potential, right? But if you take into account the resources, it's enormous. So what does unity mean for us, and what do we envisage? I don't even think we can quantify it in this conversation. It's enormous. The problem is, I don't know to what extent we are convinced of that potential, because even trading under the AFCFTA, which was supposed to encourage trade in processed and semi-processed goods and to build regional value chains, haven't done so. Most of the trade, with the exception to a few, is still limited to transaction of raw materials. That says nothing about the platform or the opportunities for going at it together. It says everything about our conviction to do it. So the potential is endless. There's enough platform, but I personally, I doubt to what extent we believe it as Africans. we believe that potential and are willing to invest in that potential.
Wow, that is really interesting. And what you said about our leadership not being convinced of our potential. And before I make a note on that particular point, I just wanted to do a quick fact check as well. You mentioned, a market potential of $1.3 billion dollars. I think that is really low. We have we have a combined business.
People.
So again,
1.3 billion people, $3.4 trillion.
Okay,
I think.
So a quick check here, according to the World Bank, we have a combined business and consumer spending of over $16 trillion in Africa. So yes. So we're not even scratching the surface yet, right? So yeah, but in terms of what you said about our leadership not being convinced of our collective potential, I remember on one of my trips to Rwanda, where I heard the president speak. And it was during, I think, Mo Ibrahim Governance Weekend in 2019. I'll never forget that particular IGW that I attended. And he said, one thing he knows for certain is that if a person walking along the road loses $100 and drops it by mistake on the streets of Rwanda, that money is going to make its way back to you one way or another. And I thought, wow, like, how is it possible that a leader has this much belief in his people and he's saying, categorically on the world stage, that he's sure that his people are trustworthy, his people are hardworking, and, we against the backdrop of that, there are some people that are against, his style of leadership or whatever, but I'm just saying, to tie this back into what you're saying about the importance of leadership believing in the people, and you can see the progress Rwanda has made up until now, under this style of leadership. So without further ado, I will try to move us on and let's talk about policy. Let's get specific here. It's easy for us to, talk and, deliberate, but imagine you had the power to implement one bold, fundable, realistic policy that reflects your approach, whether it's transactional or strategic, what would it be? And why do you believe that that policy will secure Africa's future better than the alternative? Let's hear from the pro side first, please.
I think for me, what that would look like would be a policy for that would be, and it's a mix of what the cons have said as well, i.e. coming together. I think that this fragmented model that we're operating is not working as a continent. And so even if you have bilateral negotiations or transactions as a continent, is still ultimately would benefit the individual countries, like you made mention of countries like Rwanda. But I think so the first step would be ultimately uniting, and this whole AFCFTA, we've had that paperwork since like what 2018, 2019, can't remember what year particularly, but actually now starting to implement that, right? And then the next phase of that would be, once that all of that is done, about 48 countries have ratified it. What then that means is, what are the resources you have? Nigeria, you have oil. Ghana, you have cocoa. South Africa, you have some lithium, you have diamond. And we're coming united to say, for every export that we want to export now as a continent, ultimately, each country should implement some form of value add into that process in the value chain, right? So it's like, because at the end of the day, we have as a continent, we are exporting cocoa, but then we're importing chocolates, which is more expensive. So all the value add has happened over there. So it's at some ways like saying, okay, we want to be involved in this. Now, what that is going to look like, I mean, I'm not sure. It's all still like conversations to be had. But my take would be negotiating as a continent to say, you know what, we have some things on our side. We have these resources. We want to be involved in the value chain process. We want to not just be giving you all the raw materials to do AI. We want to do some form of it in the production, manufacturing, we can say we don't have infrastructure, we don't have lights, but we do have ultimately some things to do that. So we ask them, okay, give us lights, give us money to do the infrastructure to do that. Like pay. I think that's just my personal take. I think that as a continent, we have things that we can negotiate to bring to the table. So saying, before we export our raw materials to you, we want to be involved in the process. I don't think it's too much to ask. If you say we want to do the, we want to do, I mean, that's what I would say. But yeah, the pros of top what you can say is.
Yeah, today, if I'm called to the table from an African context, I think one of the most urgent things that can be implemented is the issue of a transport protocol, and number two, common currency for me. Coming to the transport protocol, many African countries today, just as an example, import things like potatoes from the Netherlands, a lot of them. For example, in Kenya, there are high massive production of potatoes. But these agricultural products cannot just get to the market at the right time because of poor infrastructure. Assuming that there was one common highway among African countries and we build enough roads, I think the trade deficit of African countries among themselves will no longer be a problem. Number two, on the issue of Africa, the next issue is maybe what maybe Africa, for example, may need with like global superpowers. One soldier to me is the immigration. Africa has great potential in big population, especially on high tech and financial industry. But one of the most biggest problem that the multilateral system has not addressed is the immigration problem. Today, you turn up for a visa and they take your money, but you're not given the visa. I think if transactional approach, for example, can correct that imbalance and give African access to whichever market they want, I think it's going to be a game changer. On that, if you see data on that, the remittances that Africa, for example, working in places like New York, Texas, remits to their local homes, it's massive. And if there's that freedom to move among strategic partners and member countries, I think it's going to be a game changer in terms of economic numbers for Africa.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you very much for that. I'm just going to comment on, the execution of the AfCFTA, which you referred to as paperwork. Very interesting, and then you mentioned, some of the things we don't have, infrastructure, electricity, and all of that. Maybe we're focusing too much on what we don't have. Maybe we should start focusing on what we do have to be able to execute, right? And what I always think about is, during the pre-colonial era, before progress got interrupted, African civilizations exhibited sovereignty, self-sufficiency, and worldwide influence. We had kingdoms and empires that managed their own affairs, with capable governance. We structured our trade deals. We had extensive trade intertwined across the global economy. We had skilled armies. We practiced diplomacy and all of that pre-colonial era, So it's very interesting that you mentioned, how do we execute, how do we focus on what we have rather than on what we don't have. Thanks for that. I'll move on to the con side quickly. What is your policy? I see that there are some questions coming up on the chat already, but I'll hear your policy if you can deliver that in the next 3 minutes so we can take one audience question or two, maybe.
Okay, I can take that one. Because I really, in my point of view, African nations face a pivotal choice to navigate this landscape through fragmented short-term bilateral or pursue principled integration, multilateralism, and strategic partnership ensure African interests. And in terms of, we can take, for example, a transactional approach, while sometimes it expanded often come at a cost. We have the example of the second that we have given, which was ideally a good deal, but at the end of the day, it wasn't really good because the one who took advantage of that wasn't the country which was expecting to take advantage of that. Even in transactional approach, we have a win-win, but we have an impression of one side who is winning more than another one. And Africa's greatest asset is its whole collective weight. And we we have, like with the IFCT, we have already 48 countries. And that is not merely a trade agreement, but a strategic blueprint for the continent transformation. And this vision also can be of the IFCT can be achieved if countries continue to negotiate separately. That division can't be achieved of the AFCT to have a common market. So, and also the fact that we have different challenges that we need to sort. Working separately can't be the best way. Working together can lead us to a better result at the end of the day, a long-term result. I will also let my friend Lulade to continue with some few points.
Thank you. I won't take more than a minute. So just to say that if we were asked to propose something that that we can implement, I would think the best thing to do would be to go back to the boosting inter-African trade strategy and the products identified by the AFCFTA Secretariat as potentially easy wins in terms of regional production potential, tariff schedules already in place, existing demands and trade flows, and ability to test customs, logistics, and rules of origin requirements. And these are like 8 products that were already identified. They include automotives, baby food, ceramics, palm oil, coffee, and tea. And we're not just talking about the potential to trade raw materials. We're talking about the value addition potential. So there has been a good start of trading in some of these products. But I think instead of trying to implement the AFCFTA at a broader scale to cover all goods and services, it might be better to focus and zoom in on these specific products and channel all our resources and collective efforts towards ensuring that we could achieve high export commodity regional value addition within these products, and not necessarily just for the external audience, but to also help African countries import substitute. Well, so kind of by importing from their neighboring countries instead of from external actors. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think we've reached a point of convergence. I think both sides at least agree that we need to look back at the AFCFTA agreement and find the low-hanging fruits there. We can't continue to be consumers. We need to produce as well. That is great. Thank you so much. Can I throw this out to the audience then and ask, which of the 2 sides did you find most convincing? Which of the 2 sides? Tracy, do we have a poll here, or how are we going to do this? Are people going to say take a side on the chat?
They then fund us.
I mean, whilst the poll is going on, I'm just going to read through 1 or 2 questions in the chat. One is, what is the worst that could happen if Africa decided to tear down the artificial borders? What actually prevents us from doing so? Just an angel's advocate. Thank you, Richard. Does anyone want to respond to that? Okay, the poll is ongoing. Which argument did you find the most convincing?
So those are the final results, Dolopo.
Oh, okay, that's the result. Apologies, I can't read, but thanks. Yes, so that's the result. African nations should embrace a strategic approach to survive the evolution of the global order. Okay, thank you for that. But we will continue the conversation outside of here. We will post this video on social media, on our YouTube channels and on LinkedIn. And we will continue the conversation as well, in our chats. Let's not, be shy. Let's talk about this a bit more. Do any one of you, if anyone wants to come off mute and, give any comments on what our debaters have said, or perhaps our debaters can answer this question around tearing down artificial borders.
Yeah, I can go first.
Okay.
Yeah, I think like the regional integration really is the first step towards like tearing our borders and just eliminating the trade barriers, tariff and non-tariff. But I think the greatest concern for that has always been the selfish interest of consolidating power and sovereignty concerns. I think that is the main stumbling blocks. Of course, we have like weaknesses in different African countries of people being so drunk with power and others not wanting to give that. And so I think that many people view that integration as kind of downgrading themselves from the political high table that they occupy. So I think once we get that mentality out there and just focus on the economic as much as focus the economic gain as opposed to the political craftsmanship, then I think it represents the greatest and more faster path to that.
Thank you so much, Topwa. Does anyone have a comment? I see Lolan and Khadija have their hands up. Who would like to go? Lolan, can you go first, please? You have 1 minute, so if you can come mute and yeah, thank you.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Hello. Okay, can you hear me? Yeah. So, what do we think the practical eventually like the visa? You know, that's a practical. That's how.
Can everyone hear him? I can't hear him. Lolan, I think you have a problem. We cannot hear you.
Okay.
Can you try typing your question in the chat because we can't hear you, and maybe whilst you're sorting your internet, we can have Khadija go. You had a comment question, Khadija.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this forum. I just wanted to add that, do we actually believe that to put in place all of these policies, if Africa is not united in terms of, e.g., as someone from northern Nigeria within, you know, we keep talking about outside how all of these policies are not working for us, but even within, right? Are we really ready for what we're asking for? I'll give an example. As someone from northern Nigeria, can I go to eastern Nigeria and have a business, you know, a well-established business that my mind can be very settled that, okay, I have this business, it's going to be running for years to come and I'm doing very well with it. You know, there's always that fear at the back of your mind that, oh, they're going to see me as someone that is not from eastern Nigeria. And, you know, it might affect my business at some time. So I think sometimes it's this small issues that we need to address within as Africans before we start to talk about, you know, the trade agreements with foreign countries and all of that. I don't know if I'm making much sense, but you know,
I hear you very well, Khadija.
Yeah.
Charity begins at home. You know, if Africa is not united,
that's what
what are we talking about here, right?
Yes,
I mean, we always talk about what government needs to do, what the private sector needs to do, what NGOs need to do, but what do the people need to do? What do we need to do as individuals? You know, well, what we hold a stake here, and we need to start asking those questions. How do we change our collective mindsets such that we actually feel like we're united rather than, you know, having these internal wars that actually stop us from progressing. Thank you so much for that comment. It's very, very good contribution that you've made. Any other comments? Does anyone want to come off mute? Otherwise, I will ask one of the questions on the chat. Maybe someone can answer that. Any comments? Lola did, sorry, not Lola did. Lolan, were you able to sort your microphone? Probably not. Someone says to survive, African nations must embrace both approaches in order to leapfrog. we cannot ignore the capacity challenges across the continent whilst the need for ambitious vision to support the fourth industrial revolution. I may have read that wrong, but I'm conscious of time. We have 2 minutes left, but what can I say? We've had such a rich and robust discussion. I think what today's debate reminded us of is that Africa's future on the global stage is not binary. It's not a binary choice whether it's transactional or strategic, or it's a negotiation, you know. How do we get short-term wins whilst having the long-term in view? What is that mix? What is that hybrid approach that we need to take? And for sure, it is one that demands clarity, courage, and unity. Unity not just as countries, but even tribally, you know. How are we out? To what extent are we united within our tribes, within our countries, you know? So whether we take a transactional route, or we double down on strategic partnerships, or, you know, or we design a hybrid approach, we must do so with intention and with a lot of leverage as much as possible, and have a bold vision. On that note, I would like to say thank you to our incredible speakers, to the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, and to each of you for joining us. Let us keep this debate going offline, online, and on the continent. Let's, you know, amplify our voices a lot more. And until next time, I would like to say, stay curious, stay strategic, and stay engaged. Let us keep conversing. Thank you all so much.